You're listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
I like what Habakkuk, though, says. He's taking a look at the entire society prior to Ezekiel, prior to Jeremiah, and he's looking at what's going on. And this is during the time of Manasseh, just before everything gets really, really bad. And Habakkuk says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery?"
The world around us is crazy. Everywhere we look, there's some sort of chaos going on. In today's message, Pastor Ken shares from Habakkuk, a prophet from the Old Testament. Habakkuk was asking God how long all the chaos would last, and his situation was similar to our world today. When you're in a tough situation, what do you run to? Habakkuk challenges you to trust God to be your guide. When you trust God in times of trial, God will give you a way out. He wants to bring you peace to a chaotic world. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 22, as he continues his message, The Sins of the U.S., Israel.
The rulers of Judah, when given the opportunity to take a donation in order to line their pockets, and it says that here, they did it. If they could take a bribe, they took a bribe. If they could cause judgment to go against someone, then they could take their land. That way they can grab that land and turn it into a monument that belonged to somebody else. Just simply, "Oh, you don't need that anymore. You've committed a crime. We're going to take your land from you." That's what they did. We don't do that here in this country at all, do we? We just did last weekend. Again, I'm reading this and I'm going like, this is a little strange. It says they treated with contempt their own parents. Verse 7, they have treated father and mother lightly within you. Exodus 20, verse 12 says, "Honor your father and your mother that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord gives to you." They're not doing that. So are their days going to be prolonged? Not hardly. The penalty, by the way, for that type of contempt is well known. It's in the Torah. It's in Leviticus 20, verse 9. "If there is anyone who curses his father or his mother, he shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother, his blood guiltiness is upon him." So we have here in Ezekiel the fact that they have committed that crime. That's the penalty for it, death. And God's going to make sure they suffer that penalty. The verse goes on here to show that not only did they disregard their parents, verse 7, but they also are going out of their way to harm those who are new to faith. It talks about aliens. The only people who would be from outside the country working in Jerusalem at this time would either be people who wanted to become Jews, they were proselytes, or they would be slaves, either one or the other. And more than likely, there were still some folks who were coming to God even at this point in time. There were still folks who were proselytizing to become Jews. And it also talks about they're attacking the most vulnerable in society. The alien they've oppressed in your midst. Oh, and the fatherless and the widow they've wronged as well. So not only are they attacking those who want to become Jews or who want to follow God, they're also attacking those who no longer have a dad or who are widows. These are really good folks, right? I mean, they're just wonderful people. Verse 21 to 24 of chapter 22 says, "You shall not wrong a stranger." This is of Exodus. "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict him at all, and if he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry, and my anger will be kindled. And I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless." Okay, so what we've had outlined here in this one verse is capital crime, capital crime, capital crime, all in one verse. You think he's laying out the indictment. Sounds like it to me. Ezekiel 22, verses 8 to 16. "You've despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths." He's continuing. It's still unfaithfulness. "Slanderous men have been in you for the purpose of shedding blood. And in you they've eaten at the mountain shrines. Well, there are no mountains. What do you mean in Jerusalem they're eating at the mountain shrine? We'll talk about that. In your midst they've committed acts of lewdness. In you they have uncovered their father's nakedness. In you they have humbled her who was unclean in her menstrual impurity. One has committed abomination with his neighbor's wife. Another has lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law. And another in you has humbled his sister, his father's daughter. In you they have taken bribes to shed blood. You have taken interest in profits. And you have injured your neighbors for gain by oppression, and you have forgotten me, declares the Lord God. Behold then, I smite my hand at your dishonest gain, which you've acquired, and at the bloodshed which is among you. Can your heart endure, or can your hands be strong in the days that I will deal with you? I, the Lord, have spoken and will act. I will scatter you among the nations, and I will disperse you through the lands, and will consume your uncleanliness from you. You will profane yourself in the sight of the nations, and you will know that I'm the Lord. So Ezekiel's continuing on with the charges after he covered quite a few of them at the very beginning of the chapter. And now his charges bring up the issue of the Sabbaths. And it's not just a 7-day issue, it's a 7-year issue as well. There's a problem that they're having with the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath was established for the nation of Israel, for the Jew. It's not exactly something we have to follow as New Testament believers. You can if you choose to, but it's under the law. What is required of keeping the Sabbath according to Mosaic law? So we'll outline it if you were to look at it today. Number 1, no work done at all. That means you can't water the lawn, you can't work in the yard, you can't work on your hobbies, you can't go surfing, okay? No fixing flat tires. By law, if a person did not stop those types of activities, they were breaking the law, and they received a rock concert. Basically, they got stoned by people he knew. Okay, number 2, if you want to keep the Sabbath, putting it into terms for today, no kindling of a fire. That's in Exodus 35:3. That means you can't have any cookouts or barbecues. Okay? Stop those. We can't cook we wouldn't be able to cook hot dogs out here if we had to do that. Obviously, you can tell that this is an Old Testament thing. Anyway, you can't go into a restaurant and get a hamburger that's been flame broiled because they had to kindle a fire. You can't cook eggs or pancakes in the morning because you'd have to kindle a fire. And you can't drive a car because to start the car, you're kindling a fire. And by the way, that's what the Jews in Israel do today. They don't drive their cars on the Sabbath because that's kindling a fire. They're that observant. They have special light switches and everything else so that they don't turn on electric lights. And it's crazy, some of the things they do. Number 3, no traveling. That's in Exodus 16:29. The Jews later added to this law and said only a half mile of travel, which we see Jesus talk about in the Olivet Discourse. One Sabbath day travel, which meant he could walk across the street to the Mount of Olives, and that's it. But the pure law says you stay at home. But actually, if you kept this part of the law, you couldn't go to church if it was today, because it was unless the place was 1/4 of a mile away. So you'll see all these little places of gathering in Israel that are about 1/4 mile away, so people can walk to them and then walk back if they're extremely observant. And you'll actually see them on days where it's not the Sabbath. They'll actually measure the distance to make sure they're not doing that. That's a little much, but that's what they do. Oh, by the way, if you had an emergency, you can't drive to the hospital. That's a violation of the Sabbath. Number 4, Amos 8:5 says no trading. So if you have to get gas to be able to get to the church service, you can't trade money for gas. That's trading, so you can't buy gas. You just have to steal it, I guess. I don't know. But you can't buy gas. You can't trade. You can't buy a cassette tape or a CD or anything of the... We don't charge for them, okay? So you can pick up a message, and we don't charge for it. But you wouldn't be able to pay for it if we were following this. There's to be no exchange of money for goods. If you worked with stocks and bonds and you needed to sell, too bad. Okay, number 5, no marketing. That's in Nehemiah. So you can't do shopping at all, okay? So there's no stopping for ice cream after dinner on the way home. If you run out of food or drink at home, too bad. Plan ahead. This is what the law said. And they weren't following it. Number 6, a holy assembly with double the daily offering. Okay, what that meant was, and this is in Numbers 28:9, that meant that when they showed up at temple on the Sabbath, they were supposed to give not just a tenth, they were supposed to give a double. They were supposed to give a double tithe if they showed up at temple on that day. Needless to say, many of them didn't show up at temple on that day. But it was a 20%, it was double. It was a double tithe on that day. I don't know if that's one of those things you'd like to see somebody practice today, but I don't think they will. Number 7, they were supposed to have new showbread in the holy place in Leviticus 24:8. Of course, we don't have a holy place now, so that can't happen. And it shows you, again, that the Sabbath is it's not for the church. It's for the Jews. And the last part of the requirements for keeping the Sabbath day law is if you break the Sabbath, the penalty is death. It's that simple. That's just some of the things. There's actually like 690 different laws you have to follow. I can't follow 5 of them, but Israel was blowing 10 of them. They couldn't keep those. In 2 Chronicles 36, verses 20 and 21, we see that those who had escaped from the sword, he carried away to Babylon. This is what happened to the Jews. And they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. Why? To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath, until 70 years were complete. Every 7 years there was supposed to be a sabbatical year. They had not done that. So, by the way, for 490 years. So God said, we're going to make sure that we make up those Sabbaths. And it was 70 years exactly from the beginning to the end that the land was followed. The land received its Sabbaths as a result of it. And then it was time to go home. We see in Leviticus 26, 33 and 34, you, however, I will scatter among the nations and will draw out a sword after you as your land becomes desolate and your cities become waste. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation. While you're in your enemies' lands, then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. It says further in chapter 25, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crops. But during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest. A Sabbath to the Lord, you shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. And that's still being practiced in Israel today. I was reading some of the things, though, that they do to get around the Sabbath. So if you Google how to get around the Sabbath in Israel, you get page after page after page of things that you can do. They'll sell their land to a Gentile for $1 and let the Gentile farm the land for that year, and then they'll buy it back for $1 at the end of the year. Well, see, I didn't farm the land that year. They'll plant all the crops that they need that year. So if the sabbatical year starts on Monday, they'll plant everything they can up until midnight. Then they'll stop. And then they won't go out and water or irrigate, but they'll just let the land produce what it normally produces because the law will allow them to harvest what's there. But they've planted double the amount of wheat that they normally plant. It's some interesting things that they do. It really is. They have elevators, for example. If you're in one hotel, one set of elevators run automatically so you don't have to start a fire, and it stops every other floor. The other one goes to the even floors. This one goes to the odd floors. And when it stops, the door's open. You can walk out, walk in, but you don't have to push any buttons or start a fire. They even have some unique things now where they have devices where people start their cars the day before the Sabbath, and that way they don't start the fire. It's already burning when they get in the car because the car engine's been running all night. Give me a break. These are it just was amazing, the thing. And then you read Ezekiel saying you're being judged for violating the Sabbath, and I'm reading all these ways that they get, it hasn't stopped. I'm sure they probably had, I don't know, Google something then that told them all the ways to get around it too. And then it gets further in the scriptures. It says, some of the leaders participated in slandering others in order to get ahead. We don't see that happen with politicians here. And at times they were also involved in premeditated murder. Of course, we have no political figures that have ever done that in this country. They also went to various idol shrines throughout the area. And if that particular idol required a sex act to be committed as part of the worship, they were doing that. That wasn't a big deal. Whatever was necessary to be part of that congregation, they would do. No big deal. So they thought that if a person brought an offering to Baal or to Asherah and it required sex with a prostitute, that they could do that. That's not what the Lord had in mind. He didn't have that in mind at all. But the way the people believed it at this time, and the cultural thing that was going on in that area, is they felt that that would stimulate the powers of nature to have celestial sex, and then I'd have better crops next year. Really? Anyway, that's what they said they thought was happening. I like what Habakkuk, though, says. He's taking a look at the entire society prior to Ezekiel, prior to Jeremiah, and he's looking at what's going on. And this is during the time of Manasseh, just before everything gets really, really bad. And Habakkuk says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed. There is no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted." Does that sound a lot like a place that we live in? That's Habakkuk talking about Jerusalem prior to the fall of Jerusalem. Solomon was right. There's nothing new under the sun. Things tend to keep going the way they are because people are just desperately wicked. Political leaders here in the book of Ezekiel did whatever they thought they needed to do to get ahead. If they thought that they needed to take somebody's land or whatever they needed to do, they did. That's what it's saying here. And Ezekiel, and that doesn't happen in our country though, Ezekiel then moves on to the problem with sexual purity. And he says that's a problem too. How bad was the situation in regards to sexual purity in Jerusalem? I'll have to unpack this a little bit for you. There are 5 specific crimes that are listed here, okay? And he starts off by saying, "You have uncovered their father's nakedness." That's in verse 10. So what he's actually talking about there, when you unpack that, is incest with one's own mother. That's what he's talking about. Then he goes into, and another has lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law. Prior to that, he's talking about committed abomination. Let's see. They have uncovered their father's nakedness, and you have humbled her who was unclean in her menstrual impurity. That's engaging in sex with someone while ritually impure. So that they were doing that. The language, by the way, in the Hebrew implies it's non-consensual. The next indictment is adultery with their neighbor's wife. And then taking sexual advantage of their daughters-in-law, that's listed here. And then finally, engaging in incestual relationships with their own sisters is listed here as well. You think they have a problem. I mean, it sounds like they all live in Hollywood. It really does. Unfortunately, all that's been in the news in the last year there, pretty much. As stated by Habakkuk, there's no justice since bribes are being accepted. And this is so they can cover up the murders that were mentioned earlier. They're paying off the judges. So what we see is that they're violating the people's trust by using positions of power for their own advantage. And these crimes take 2 forms. They capitalize on their neighbor's indebtedness by demanding interest on loans, and they make profit by extortion. Great people. And we're not even to verse 12 yet. We're still in verse 12. The basic problem ends, verse 12. The people have forgotten God. This is why all of the issues going on in the first 11 verses and part of verse 12 are going on. You have forgotten me, declares the Lord God. And this is the first time Ezekiel says this about the people, that they've forgotten God. They don't know who he is anymore. In Romans chapter 1, we get a commentary on this from Paul. Paul talks about what was going on with the people, but he also says this is a pattern that continues on and even continues on today. Since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, they didn't acknowledge him, they forgot him. He abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness: sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning, and they disobey their parents. I think that's interesting how those two are brought together. They refuse to understand, they break their promises, are heartless, and have no mercy. They know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die, yet they do them anyway. Worse yet, they encourage others to do them too. I love the way that the New Living Translation puts that, because it makes it sound, we're not talking about just as the people during Ezekiel's time and just the people in Rome that Paul's talking about, but we're also talking about people around us today. It's a ongoing standard that God's laws do not change. Whatever he has set out is always the same. It never changes. This is where Judah was at this time, historically. They're right in the middle here of Romans chapter 1. And I feel like I'm talking about the United States, too. It's unfortunate, but I feel like I am. So by the time we get to verse 13, God is ready to announce the sentence based on all the evidence that's been presented up to this point. And the evidence has actually accelerated the need for judgment. So it's going to happen sooner rather than later because of what's going on. And the evil has to be purged. And the evil is the people. That's what's got to be purged. He's going to scatter them among the nations and disperse them throughout the lands. They're going to be scattered throughout the world. Where are all the Jews coming from back to Israel today? Everywhere. I mean, there's a Jewish community in India that's now interested in coming back. They're from everywhere in the world. And this was promised to them if they didn't obey, and yet they didn't obey. But it was promised. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 27 to 30, the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you'll be left few in number among the nations where the Lord drives you. There you'll serve gods, the work of man's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. But from there you'll seek the Lord your God, and you'll find him. So what he's saying is that you're going to go there and you're going to be worshiping idols initially, but then you're going to realize what happened, and you're going to turn back to God. And they did in Babylon. But the first group of folks who left were idol worshipers. And they thought it was great. Hey, now we're in a place where it's accepted. Well, they remembered God, and they remembered there's issues. It says, from there you'll seek the Lord your God, and you'll find him if you search him with all your heart and all your soul. And when you're in distress and all these things have come upon you, in the latter days you'll return to the Lord your God and listen to his voice. We're still waiting for the nation of Israel as a whole to hear his voice and return to him. But the people are returning to the land. The Jewish people wanted to worship the gods of the Gentiles. So why not go live with them to do it? But God says he's going to humiliate them in the eyes of the Gentiles. And that'll help bring the people back as well. I mean, prior to all of the recent events that have taken place in France, the French Jews were very happy to live there. But now that there has been killings, and there are groups of people trying to kill them, humiliate them, they all want to go home. They all want to go to Israel. That's promised in the Scriptures. Starting in verse 17, Ezekiel begins to talk about how God intends to drain the swamp and rid the land of Judah of the problem. But he uses different terms. He uses fire and refining as his terms for cleaning out what was going on there.
You've been listening to a message from Ezekiel on the Unsafe Bible. Pastor Ken has been diving deep into this major prophet to help us all understand how to apply these messages to our lives today. Have you ever found yourself falling into the trap of sin, suffering the consequences, and then, only after you realize it's too late, you offer up a prayer and ask God, "Why me?" It's a classic case of you made your bed and now you have to sleep in it. But you still ask the question, as if to suggest you may not be guilty. Well, as we see here in Ezekiel, that has been one of man's greatest weaknesses throughout history. If you want to hear more, don't hesitate to contact us. You can get in touch with us by going to theunsafebible.com. Once there, use the Connect tab and click on Connect Card. Just fill out the form and we'll reach out to you. To listen to this message or any others from Pastor Ken, just look under the Media tab at theunsafebible.com. If you found this ministry to be a blessing to you as you've been listening, you can show us your support for the Unsafe Bible Ministry by checking out the Give tab. No gift is too big or too small, and will help us continue to reach the lost with God's Word. Any other questions? Feel free to explore theunsafebible.com for more information about when and where we meet. Directions can be found on the Contact tab. We're based out of Jupiter, Florida, and want to invite you to join us in person for our next service. Until then, we want to thank you for joining us right here on the Unsafe Bible.